On the morning of May 10th, an estimated 1,500 people assembled on Promontory Summit. The vast majority were rail workers, but some local citizens made their way to the site, joining a military detachment bound for San Francisco. All gathered under a flag that featured 36 stars. At this moment of moments, Utah's leading citizen and primary railroad contractor was nowhere to be found.
Brigham Young had to be thinking about the amount of money that was owed to his people at that point when they were doing all of the celebrating, because there were still a lot of bills that hadn't been paid. I think the reason that he didn't go was a smart one, because this celebration was not in any local control. And if Young had gone up there and been snubbed, the way that he'd been snubbed by many of the Union Pacific people over the past months, it would have been very embarrassing to him politically among his own people.
Brigham Young turned his back on the ceremony and traveled to settlements in southern Utah. By his reckoning, the railroad companies owed him over $1 million as they gathered at Promontory. The ceremony moved to its final stage, and a rail spike of pure gold was presented. But counter to folklore, it was never hammered as the final spike. Instead, it was slipped into a pre-drilled hole for show, and then was quickly pulled out. Officials from the Central Pacific and Union Pacific swung heavy hammers at a final iron spike, and they missed. But it was enough to trigger a one-word message from the telegraph operators.
Done, D-O-N-E. And that brought great celebration all across the country.
And then simultaneously, a cannon looking over the Pacific and a cannon looking over the Atlantic boom out the notice to the world. Tens of thousands of people in Chicago and San Francisco and Sacramento and Washington, D.C. and New York and all of the major towns and small towns erupt into a wild tumult of celebration.
To His Excellency, General U.S. Grant, President of the United States. Sir, we have the honor to report the Pacific Railroad is finished. Leland Stanford.
Souvenir hunters dropped onto the track, prying up dozens of spikes and splintering the last wooden rail tie into pieces until it disappeared into 100 different hands. The race was over. Symbolically, a new race was beginning, as many were left scrambling for a piece of the moment.
Well, it's almost like waking up with a hangover after a great party, because the problems of railroad construction started coming home to roost after the great party of completion.
In April, before the line was completed, Brigham Young had dispatched his son to Boston to confront the Union Pacific Board of Directors and demand payment of close to $1 million.
April 3, 1869. The affairs of the Union Pacific are in a muddle. Credit is weak, and there is a general apprehension they will not meet their obligations. If the money is ever collected from them, it will be in the next world. Your son, Joseph A. Young.
From his earliest pronouncements from the pulpit, Brigham Young had staked a personal claim to the railroad work that he said was divinely inspired. It was Brigham's contract, his negotiating skills that would secure the best deal for Mormon workers. It was his plan to keep out the evil influences and extract the good.
He hoped it would bring cash revenues, and the Union Pacific was notoriously corrupt and resulting in congressional investigations. And so the result was that virtually no cash came in terms of what had been promised and contracted.
This was just a tremendous shock to Utah, and we find by the summer of 1869, we find the territory just thrown out onto the barter system because there was no cash.
Mormon railroad workers had signed IOUs to local businesses for food and clothing. Businesses had borrowed money to stay in business. The territorial economy was failing because of the unpaid railroad work. Brigham Young attempted to remind the Union Pacific of T.C. Durant's promises.
When you were present, you were pleased to make a promise to my sons Brigham and John W. that if we would keep on a large workforce, you would pay what it is worth.
Durant would not respond. Instead, the letters Young received were from destitute fellow church members who begged for their pay. One, Bernard Snow, had served as a subcontractor, hiring hundreds of men to work on the rail line for up to 1 year.
July 26, 1869. May God bless them, for they have suffered severely. I must ask you, what will be done to satisfy their claims? They have not been paid 1 cent. Bernard Snow.
But for others, the losses were measured in more than money.
You have the firm of Benson, Farr & West, who had agreed to grade between Humboldt Wells in Nevada all the way up into the Promontory Mountains. And basically, Chauncey West was the youngest man. He was in his early 40s at that point, and he really took the brunt of the work, the supervision, and got himself into some real hot water financially. When people were asking to be paid, and he still had not been paid by the Central Pacific, he advanced his own money, and so he was virtually ruined by this whole thing with the railroad.
Brigham Young tried to intervene in West's behalf with Leland Stanford, reminding Stanford of the promises that had been made during the fierce final stage of competition.
You promised me that if I telegraphed Bishop West to take charge of the work and crowd it through, you would see that he was made whole or indemnified to the full extent. It was no matter what the work cost. The object was to have the work done.
Chauncey West, polygamist husband to several wives, father to more than 24 children, pursued Leland Stanford in California. In a San Francisco hotel room, he dropped dead of a stroke at the age of 43. His partner, LDS Church apostle Ezra Taft Benson, died the same week. In Boston, Brigham's son Joseph made one final headstrong push on the Union Pacific Board of Directors, recounting his confrontation in a letter home to his father.
I wish to know whether it is the intention of this company to keep President Young out of $750,000. If so, the Union Pacific will swindle the very men who built the railroad. Remember, the road is out in our country, and I think we can pull hard enough so you can feel it on the other end.
At one point, one of the board members threatened Young that he was going to have the Army descend upon Utah and take out the LDS command. And Young replied that he would go to the courts. And he said, if it's necessary, then this will be a fight to the knife.
Brigham Young viewed the threat of military intervention as an excuse for anti-Mormon forces to destroy the kingdom of God in the American West. He put John Sharp, a lawyer, Mormon church leader, and railroad contractor, in charge of negotiations with the Union Pacific. Brigham also worked to quell the fears of financial panic in the Utah Territory. He suspended church tithing payments, used church food storehouses to feed the hungry, and urged his followers to put cooperation above profit and debt.
The embarrassment caused me by the failure of the company to pay me as per contract means the whole business of our territory is suffering greatly, and our merchants are severely cramped, having advanced means to the graders of the road, who are unable to pay because the company has not kept their engagements with me.
It soon became clear that a handful of well-connected deal-makers had made millions in building the Transcontinental Railroad by being on the inside, skimming profits, and walking away when they could. Despite being one of the earliest investors in the Union Pacific, Brigham Young had been one of the many left on the outside. So obvious was the economic slight that another unpaid contractor actually took pity on Brigham Young.